Why was the room suddenly so quiet? The armory was never silent. It was a place of metal clinks, low murmurs, and the familiar bite of gun oil. Yet, in that moment, it felt as if the air itself had paused. Conversations that once echoed between weapon racks now fell into stillness. Every soldier, mechanic, and officer had turned their gaze toward the center of the room, where a challenge was being born, one that would ripple far beyond the confines of steel and concrete. At the heart of it stood Master Sergeant Cole Hawk, a sniper whose legend outlived even the wars he had fought in. Men spoke his name with the same reverence they reserved for survival itself. Hawk wasn't simply a soldier. He was a living myth carved into scars and whispered in the barracks during nights when new recruits couldn't sleep. He carried the Medal of Honor not as a decoration, but as a wound that never healed, a reminder of the brothers buried beneath foreign soil. But tonight, Hawk wasn't retelling stories. He wasn't instructing recruits on windage or scope discipline. Tonight, his voice carried something different, sharper, almost playful, but edged with steel. "Tell you what, Lieutenant," he said, eyes locking onto Vega. She was the face in the room, a lieutenant barely months into her transfer, had sharp eyes, sharper than most dared to admit, and a way of standing that betrayed quiet confidence. Yet that confidence had not been enough to pierce the wall of judgment she had walked into. The armory's air had always felt heavier since her arrival. Whispers trailed her footsteps like shadows. "Rookie. Too green. Doesn't know what it means to bleed for a mile-long shot." Hawk's smirk deepened, and his words struck like rounds chambered one by one. 3,800 meters. One shot. You hit it, I'll give you something I swore I'd never gamble with. His fingers tapped the small metal pin to his chest. Gasps broke the silence. Soldiers shifted in disbelief. Some stiffened. Some leaned forward as if they hadn't heard him correctly. The Medal of Honor, the one thing untouchable, sacred even among warriors hardened by dust, steel, and loss. To wager it was madness. To offer it was unthinkable. Stood her ground. Her throat tightened, yet her gaze didn't falter. She knew what this meant. This wasn't about a shot. This wasn't about a medal. This was about belonging, about silencing every whisper that followed her into every room. "And if I miss?" she asked, her voice low, steady. Hawk didn't hesitate. His smile was wide, but his tone carried weight. "Then you carry my pack 6 months, every march, every climb, no excuses." Laughter broke out. Soldiers slapped shoulders, shaking their heads. Carrying Hawk's pack was punishment in itself, notorious for being overloaded, heavier than regulation required, but didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto his. For one fragile, unshaken second, silence returned, dense as the pause before a trigger breaks. The deal was struck. That night when the armory emptied and laughter faded into the halls, sat alone at her bunk. The metal frame creaked beneath her as she laid the rifle across her lap. The weapon wasn't just steel and optics. Tonight it was a burden and a prayer. She worked the cloth across its barrel, hands trembling not from fear but from the sheer weight of tomorrow. The whispers of the day clung to her ears. "Too young, too green, doesn't belong." Her father's voice slipped through memory like smoke. A soldier himself, long buried but never gone. "A bullet doesn't just fly, it tells a story. You guide it, but the story belongs to how much of your heart you put into the trigger." She whispered it back into the silence. The words steadied her pulse. The rifle gleamed beneath the dim light. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, a reflection she wasn't sure she recognized. Sleep never came. When dawn broke, it wasn't gentle. The desert sun rose with cruelty, spilling heat across sand and stone, burning shadows into submission. The shooting range stretched like an ocean of dust and silence. Out at its edge, a steel plate shimmered in the haze, a target no larger than a dinner tray. At 3,800 meters, it was less than a speck, a mirage teasing the eyes. Soldiers gathered in a loose semicircle, boots grinding into the sand. Word of the challenge had spread through the base like fire. No one wanted to miss history, no matter how foolish they believed it to be. Whispers threaded through the crowd, but today those whispers held something new: anticipation. Lay prone on the ridge. The rifle nestled into her shoulder, the scope glinting as she adjusted. Her breathing slowed, falling into rhythm with the faint pulse of desert wind. Sweat slipped down her temple, but her grip didn't falter. Hawk stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw set, his face unreadable. "Remember," his voice was low, meant only for her. "At this distance, it's not just the rifle. It's the air, the spin of the earth, even the humidity. Everything's against you." She adjusted her scope, her fingers moving with practiced certainty. She had spent the night poring over charts, wind speeds, ballistic tables, the lay of the land. But none of that felt like enough. Numbers couldn't quiet the pounding in her chest. Her father's words whispered again. "The bullet tells a story." Exhaled. The desert hushed. For a fleeting moment, even the heat seemed to stop. She pulled the trigger. Thunder cracked across the range. Dust leapt from the barrel, curling into the air like smoke from an altar. The bullet, invisible, alive, cut through silence. Seconds stretched. Eternity held its breath. Then faint but undeniable. Clang! The steel plate sang back. The crowd erupted. Cheers broke through disbelief. Soldiers who doubted her shouted in stunned laughter. Those who had quietly hoped let loose their voices like floodgates. The desert wasn't silent anymore. Lifted her head, her face unreadable, but her lips betrayed her. A faint, almost invisible smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. For the first time since she arrived, she wasn't the rookie. She wasn't the outsider. She was the one who made the impossible shot. Behind her, Hawk remained still. His arms unfolded slowly, his gaze heavy. For a long, unbroken moment, he said nothing. Then, with footsteps measured, he began to close the distance between them. Soldiers hushed again, eyes darting, waiting for his verdict. But Hawk didn't speak. Not yet. His silence carried weight, heavier than the pack he had threatened to strap on her shoulders. And heart steady at last, wondered if she had just rewritten more than a bet. Perhaps she had rewritten herself. Why did Hawk say anything? The silence after the shot was almost more unbearable than the weight of the rifle itself. Could still feel the vibrations of the trigger beneath her finger, could still hear the echo of that faint steel clang playing over and over in her mind. The crowd had cheered, laughed, gasped, but now, as Hawk stepped closer, everything fell still again. His boots pressed into the dust, steady and deliberate, like each step was a decision. His throat tightened. She held her breath without realizing it. Every soldier's eyes followed Hawk, waiting for him to speak, waiting for a gesture, a word, anything. His medal of honor gleamed faintly in the sun, the very thing he had gambled on. He stopped just behind her, his shadow cutting across her prone form. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. They were unreadable, a storm hidden behind a wall of calm. "Pack it up," he said finally, his voice flat. That was it, no congratulations. No, just 2 words. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some looked at, others at Hawk, unsure what the silence meant. The cheers died awkwardly in their throats, replaced by the grinding of boots and murmurs. Soldiers began to drift away, some shaking their heads, others whispering disbelief. Stood slowly, brushing sand from her uniform. Her heart had steadied during the shot, but now it beat unevenly again. Had she done enough? Had she silenced them, or had Hawk's silence stolen that from her? Hawk turned without another word and walked away, his back straight, his pace unbroken, the medal still pinned to his chest. And just like that, was alone again. That night the barracks hummed with quiet conversation. She could hear her name whispered in corners, carried down hallways, stitched into sentences she wasn't meant to overhear. Some spoke with awe, she hid it. Others with doubt, fluke, had to be. A few carried something sharper, resentment wrapped in humor. Sat on her bunk, rifle dismantled before her. Each piece lined carefully, each movement deliberate. Her hands were steady this time, but her chest was tight. She replayed Hawk's words, or rather, his lack of them. Why hadn't he said anything? Why not admit what everyone else had seen? The truth was simple, though she didn't want to admit it to herself. Respect wasn't handed over with a single shot. Not in this unit. Not with these men. Not with Hawk watching. The following days blurred into drills, marches, and the relentless grind of training. Heat blistered the skin, sweat stung the eyes, and silence weighed heavier than rucksacks. Hawk remained as he always was: sharp, focused, unyielding. He didn't look at differently, didn't treat her with the awe some of the others now carried. If anything, he seemed colder. And that unsettled her. One evening, during a weapons maintenance session, found herself across the table from him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, rifles lay scattered, soldiers themselves with brushes and oil. Hawk worked silently, hands moving with mechanical precision. Tried not to glance his way, but his presence pulled at her like gravity. Finally he spoke, his tone low enough that only she could hear. "You think one shot changes anything?" She froze, the brush in her hand halted mid-stroke. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the bolt he was cleaning. Respect isn't about hitting steel when everyone's watching. It's about carrying weight when no one is. Her jaw clenched. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, to tell him that weight was all she'd carried since the day she'd put on the uniform. But no words came, none that wouldn't sound like protest. Instead, she asked, "Then why wager the medal?" That made him stop, just for a second. The piece of steel in his hand stilled and his eyes flicked up, sharp, cutting into her. Then, just as quickly, he looked back down and resumed cleaning. "Because sometimes," he said, "you don't know who someone is until you put something sacred on the line." Said nothing. She didn't know if that meant she'd passed or failed. The days stretched on, and though Hawk's silence never softened, something shifted in the air. The soldiers who once whispered now watched her differently. Not all, but enough. Some nodded when she passed in the hallway. Others offered a word, a small gesture, as though acknowledging what had been undeniable, that she had done something none of them had. But whispers never die completely, and for every nod of respect, there was still the quiet sting of doubt. Weeks later, under the dim glow of the setting sun, the unit prepared for deployment. Orders had come down. Not training, not drills, a mission. One that pulled them out of barracks and classrooms and back into the place where mistakes meant more than bruises. The atmosphere changed overnight. Jokes faded. Smiles dulled. Even the loudest men fell quiet as rucksacks were packed and rifles inspected. A heaviness took hold, the kind that only came when boots were about to hit soil where the air smelled like danger. Felt it in her chest. She had spent so long trying to prove she belonged in their ranks, but now the test would be written in fire and silence. The night before they left, she sat outside the barracks, the desert chill settling around her shoulders. She watched the horizon fade into shadow, stars pushing their way through the darkness. For the first time in weeks, Hawk approached. His steps were quieter this time. No audience, no stage. He stood beside her without a word for a long while, staring out at the same horizon. Then, finally, he spoke. "Out there," he said softly, "nobody cares about your shot." Turned her head slightly. His profile was carved in shadow, unreadable as ever. "They care if you come back," he continued. "They care if the person next to them comes back. That's it, nothing else." The words lingered. They weren't cruel nor dismissive. They were honest. Nodded, the lump in her throat tightening. "I know." He looked at her then, eyes steady, searching, as if trying to see whether she truly did. After a long moment he gave the smallest nod, barely visible, almost nothing at all. But too, it was everything. That night she didn't whisper her father's words. She didn't need to. For the first time, she carried them quietly inside her chest. Tomorrow the mission would come, and with it a new story. Why did the desert feel different tonight? It wasn't the same desert that had watched her make the impossible shot. That one had been a proving ground, a stage set against heat and silence. This one was colder, heavier, alive with anticipation that pressed against the skin. The unit stood ready near the airfield, rucksacks lined like shadows, rifles slung tight. Engines rumbled in the distance, helicopters waiting with blades whispering promises of fire and dust. Orders were simple on paper, too simple. Infiltration, observation, extraction. Words that hid the reality of danger. A compound across the border, intelligence suggesting a weapons transfer that could tilt a conflict's scale. The kind of mission whispered about long after, when men counted who had come back and who hadn't. Adjusted the strap of her pack, feeling the weight dig into her shoulder. Hawk's words replayed in her mind. Out there, nobody cares about your shot. They care if you come back. She tightened her grip on the strap. She cared about both. The helicopter swallowed them into its roar. Inside, red light bathed faces into ghostly masks. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, silent, staring ahead, lost in their own thoughts. Sat across from Hawk. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady. If fear lived in him, it was buried deep. She wondered if they all thought she was afraid. Maybe they were right. Her chest was tight, her palms damp, but fear wasn't new. Fear had been her companion since her first day in uniform. Fear was simply proof that she was human. What mattered was what she did with it. The helicopter dropped into darkness. Dust exploded beneath the landing gear, wind slashing across their faces as they disembarked. The desert stretched wide, endless, indifferent. Stars hung sharp in the black sky. Night vision cut the world into shades of green. They moved, quiet, precise shadows against sand. The compound lay miles ahead, a shape hidden in the night. Every crunch of a boot, every scrape of gear felt louder than it was. Time stretched thin, each second drawn tight like wire. His rifle weighed against her chest. She could feel the heartbeat beneath it, rapid but steadying as she fell into rhythm with the team. She had drilled this march 100 times. She had trained for the silence, the focus. Yet training never carried the weight of reality. Out here, mistakes meant graves. An hour in, the team halted. Hawk crouched, his hand raised. Through the NVG glow, saw him motion toward the ridge. A faint glimmer ahead, the compound's outer light. Walls of mud, brick, and steel, guarded but not fortified enough to suggest complacency. The target was real. Vega, Hawk's whisper cut through Calm's eyes. Her pulse spiked. This was her moment. She slid forward, prone against the ridge, scope pressed to her eye. The world narrowed into crosshairs and breath. Through the glass, shapes moved. Guards at the gate, rifles slung, scanning the night without real conviction. Too routine, too comfortable. "Two at the gate," she whispered. "One tower, west corner. Movement inside, can't confirm numbers." Her voice was steady, though her chest pounded. Hawk leaned beside her, scanning with his own optics. He didn't speak right away. Finally, he gave a small nod, the kind that meant she was right. The team fanned out, settling into positions. The desert night closed in, quiet as prayer. Kept her scope on the tower. The guard leaned lazily against the railing, cigarette glowing faintly. He looked small, almost fragile in her sight picture. It always struck her, the way men became nothing more than silhouettes through glass. Human, yes, but distant. Hawk's voice again, low in her ear. "Hold, we're here for eyes, not noise." She swallowed. He was right. One shot would unravel everything. Tonight wasn't about proving skill. It was about patience, silence. Minutes bled into hours. The desert grew colder, breath visible even beneath the NVGs. Muscles stiffened, eyes burned, but no one moved. Every second stretched thin, every moment daring them to blink first. Inside the compound, lights flickered on, trucks moved. Shadows of men shifted crates, heavy, deliberate, focus sharpened. She counted, tracked, recorded silently. Each face, each gesture, each weapon etched into memory. Her chest tightened. Something was wrong. The movement wasn't random. It was too precise, too rehearsed. She whispered into comms. "This isn't transfer, this is loading. They're preparing to move." Hawk's silence stretched a beat too long. Then, copy, stay sharp. The hours dragged until the order finally came. Extraction. They had what they needed: proof, patterns, enough to paint the picture for command. The team began to withdraw one by one, shadows peeling away from the ridge. Lingered, her scope still on the tower, on the glow of cigarettes and the shuffle of boots. Something gnawed at her chest. It was too easy, too clean. Then she saw it. Movement on the far side. Not guards, not routine. A patrol breaking away, heading into the desert toward their path of retreat. Her voice snapped through comms. Movement, east flank, 5, maybe more, they're sweeping. The team froze. Hawk's voice came steady. All units hold. Vega, confirm. She tracked them, her scope adjusting with slow precision. 5 figures, armed, moving deliberately, searching. Confirmed, she whispered. They know. The silence that followed was sharp, filled with realization. Their cover was gone. Hawk's voice finally cut through. Options. His breath caught. Her scope lingered on the patrol, her finger near the trigger but frozen by his earlier words. Not about your shot, about coming back. The patrol closed distance. Too close, too fast. Her mind raced. If she fired, the compound would wake. If she didn't, the patrol would find them. For the first time since her impossible shot, felt truly alone. The decision was Hawk's. It wasn't the team. It was hers. She exhaled slowly. The crosshairs steadied. The desert hushed again, waiting. What happens when hesitation becomes deadly? His finger rested against the trigger, her breath steady, her heart thundering. The patrol moved closer, each step dragging inevitability across the sand. 5 men, rifles slung, eyes sharp. They weren't wandering. They were searching. The worst kind of silence pressed down on her, the silence of a choice no one else could make for her. Through comms, Hawk's voice came low. Vega. Her lips parted, but no words came. She knew the cost of firing. The entire compound would ignite. The trucks, the guards, the shadows she'd been tracking for hours would come alive in chaos. But if she held back, the patrol would stumble into their retreat, and the team would be cornered in the open. Her father's voice returned like a whisper in her chest. A bullet doesn't just fly, it tells a story. Exhaled, the world narrowed into crosshairs. She squeezed. The crack split the night. The first man dropped before his body realized it was dead. Chaos rippled instantly. The others scrambled, shouting into the dark. A second shot rang, clean, precise, cutting down another before his warning cry reached the compound. The last 3 fired wildly, desperate sprays carving through the sand. The team flattened, shadows melting into stone. Contact, Hawk's voice snapped across comms. Engage and move. The desert exploded with sound. Rifles barked, dust kicked up like storms. Scope danced, searching, cutting, firing. Each pull of the trigger echoed louder in her chest than the last. She wasn't counting anymore. She wasn't thinking of medals or bets or whispers. She was simply surviving. But the compound woke. Floodlights flared, beams slicing across the night. Alarms howled. Doors slammed open. Trucks roared to life. And with them, the inevitable flood of men spilling out like hornets from a nest. Fall back, Hawk commanded. The team moved, rifles covering rifles, each man's step depending on the others. Pressed herself into the ground, firing into shadows, buying seconds for movement. Her chest burned, her breath ragged, but her hands stayed steady. Hawk dropped beside her, his voice sharp but calm. We're not ghosts anymore, time to vanish. They broke from the ridge, sprinting into the desert's embrace. Boots pounded, gear clattered, lungs dragged in fire. Behind them, the compound roared with pursuit. Trucks rumbled forward, headlights cutting through the dark. Bullets snapped overhead, whining past ears and shoulders. Legs ached, her pack digging deep into her back. But she pushed harder, keeping pace, refusing to stumble. Every step was survival. Every heartbeat was defiance. The first explosion ripped the silence. A rocket tore into the sand yards from their path, throwing dust and fire skyward. The shockwave slammed into her chest, stealing breath, rattling bones. She hit the ground, ears ringing. Hawk's hand was on her shoulder instantly, dragging her up. "Move," he barked. They pressed on, weaving through ridges and dunes. The desert became a labyrinth of shadows and noise. Pursuers shouted, engines roared closer. The team fired in bursts, controlled and sharp, but it was clear the enemy wasn't retreating. They wanted blood. Finally, Hawk signaled. The unit dove into a dry wadi, a shallow cut in the earth that offered fleeting cover. Dropped beside the others, chest heaving, rifle tight against her. "Status," Hawk demanded. Voices came back, two with grazes, one limping but moving, no one down, not yet. Glanced at Hawk. His face was grim, jaw set like stone. For the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes, calculation laced with worry. "They'll keep coming," she whispered. He looked at her, meeting her gaze in the green glow of NVGs. For once he didn't dismiss her words. "Yeah," he said quietly, "they will." The radio crackled, static spitting through the air. Command's voice broke through, strained and clipped. "Extraction point compromised. Alternative inbound. 40 minutes. Hold position." 40 minutes. His gut twisted. They didn't have 40 minutes. The team spread along the wadi, rifles braced, eyes scanning. Shadows moved at the ridge. Muzzles flared. Bullets chewed earth and stone, sparks showering. The night turned into chaos again. Pressed her cheek to the stock, her finger finding rhythm. Shot after shot, her world became recoil and breath. She wasn't proving herself anymore. She wasn't carrying judgment. She was carrying lives. "Vega, right flank," Hawk called. She pivoted, catching movement, dropping another silhouette. Her chest hammered, sweat stung her eyes, but her hands never wavered. Minutes dragged like hours. The enemy pressed harder, waves trying to break against their fragile wall. And then silence. The gunfire stopped. Froze. That silence wasn't victory. It was worse. Hawk's voice was low. "They're regrouping." The desert held its breath. Then faintly heard it, engines again, but deeper, heavier. Trucks weren't alone anymore. The metallic grind of armor. Her stomach dropped. "They brought vehicles," she whispered. Hawk's jaw clenched. He looked down the line at his men. They were exhausted, bleeding, but still steady, still ready. And in that moment understood the truth of what he'd said nights ago. Out here, no one cared about the shot. They cared about coming back. But survival felt like a fading horizon. As headlights swept across the ridge, Hawk leaned toward her. His voice was steady, almost too calm. "You brought us this far," he said. "Don't waste it now." His breath caught. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't testing her. For the first time, his words carried weight not of challenge, but of belief. The vehicles crested the ridge, lights blinding. Engines roared. The desert seemed to tremble. His fingers curled around the trigger. Her heart pounded not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't about medals or bets or respect. It was about whether she could hold the line long enough for 40 minutes to mean survival. The desert hushed once more. And she was ready. How long can 40 minutes really last? Time stretched thin, fragile as glass. The wadi's shallow cover felt smaller with every passing second, the desert sky roaring with the engines of armored trucks closing in. Headlights swept across the ridge, beams of white fire cutting into their hiding place. Pressed herself into the sand, her rifle clutched tight, breath burning her throat. Hawk's voice broke the silence, calm but edged with steel. "We don't outrun them, we hold." The words landed heavy. The men shifted, shoulders stiffening. Hold against armor, against numbers that swelled with each passing minute, but no one argued. Orders weren't questioned out here. Orders were survival. Scope caught the first wave of shadows spilling from trucks. Dozens of them, rifles gleaming in the headlights. They moved with urgency, spreading along the ridge like a tide preparing to crash. Her pulse quickened. For every figure she tracked, 3 more seemed to appear. "On my mark," Hawk whispered. The unit's rifles raised in unison, barrels steady despite shaking lungs and bleeding arms. Mark! The wadi erupted. Bullets tore through the night, muzzle flashes strobing the ridge. Men dropped, silhouettes crumpling into sand, but the wave didn't stop. It thickened, pressed harder, returning fire with a storm of sparks and dust. Its world narrowed into crosshairs and breath. Each shot was deliberate, each trigger pull an act of defiance. She wasn't thinking of Hawk, or the whispers, or the metal pin to his chest. She thought only of the men beside her, the ones who counted on her aim to keep them breathing. The first truck roared forward, headlights blinding, its mounted gun spraying fire into the wadi. Bullets chewed earth and stone, ripping the night into chaos. The unit dove deeper, pressing against the walls of dirt, return fire snapping upward. Hawk barked into comms, his voice like iron. Focus fire on the gunner. Steadied, her scope locking onto the blur of movement atop the vehicle. She exhaled, pulled, and watched the silhouette collapse. The gun went silent. The truck swerved, slowed, then exploded in sparks as grenades from the team tore through its engine. Cheers cracked through the noise, brief but fierce. But victory was fleeting. More engines roared behind the ridge. More shadows poured forward. The tide never slowed. Shoulder ached from recoil. Her cheek burned against the rifle stock. Her ears rang with the chorus of fire, yet she pressed on, her shots carving through the chaos like thread through fabric. Minutes bled into eternity. 5, 10, 15 time lost meaning. Sweat drenched her back, sand clung to her lips, blood dripped from a cut along her temple she hadn't felt until now. Her lungs begged for air, but her hands stayed steady, always steady. Then came the silence. Not complete, the engine still rumbled, shouts still echoed, but the gunfire lulled. Blinked through her scope, scanning. The shadows had pulled back, regrouping. Why they stop? Someone whispered. No answer came. Then faintly heard it, a new sound, deeper, slower, heavier. Drags. Her chest tightened. Armor, she whispered. The word turned blood cold. Trucks were one thing, armored carriers were another. Their thin cover wouldn't last against heavy rounds. The ground vibrated as the first carrier crested the ridge, its silhouette monstrous against the star-strewn sky. Its cannon swung slowly, deliberate as judgment, toward the wadi. For the first time that night, felt despair claw at her chest. This wasn't a fight they could win. This was survival measured in seconds, not minutes. Hawk's voice came steady, unshaken. Vega with me. She turned, stunned. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp, unyielding. He wasn't asking. He was pulling her into the center of something bigger than orders. He pointed toward the pack slung across one of the men's shoulders. Demo charges, limited, precious. Their only answer to steal. Pulse spiked, he couldn't mean. Move, Hawk barked. They crawled through the dirt, fire sparking overhead as the enemy pushed closer again. Hawk tore open the pack, hands moving with practiced precision, wiring explosives with calm urgency. Covered him, firing in bursts, each shot holding the tide back by inches. Think you can place this? Hawk asked, holding up the shaped charge. Her throat went dry. On the carrier. His eyes cut through her. You scared? She almost laughed. Scared didn't begin to cover it, but she shook her head. No. A beat passed. His lips curved, not in mockery, but in something sharper, approval. Good, he said, because scared gets you killed. The plan was insane. Impossible, but impossible was all they had. The carrier rolled closer, its cannon lowering, lights washing over the wadi. Hawk shoved the charge into her hands, his own rifle slung tight. On my signal, he said, we move fast. His chest pounded. Every instinct screamed to stay down, to vanish into the sand. But she gripped the charge, her father's words steady in her mind. A bullet tells a story. Maybe explosives did too. Hawk gave the signal. They burst from cover, sprinting into the blinding wash of headlights. Shouts erupted. Bullets tore the air, sparking off stone, kicking dust into their lungs. Hawk's rifle barked beside her, sharp and relentless, cutting down silhouettes that turned too slow. Legs burned, each stride heavier than the last, but she pushed harder, the carrier looming like a wall of death before her. She slid into its shadow, hands trembling as she pressed the charge against steel. Fingers fumbled with the magnetic clamps, heart pounding louder than the gunfire. For a breathless second, she thought it wouldn't stick. Then it locked, firm, final. "Clear," Hawk shouted. They dove back toward the wadi, sand tearing skin, lungs screaming. Behind them, the carrier's cannon swung, searching for them. The explosion split the night. Flame erupted, metal shrieked. The ground shook as the carrier collapsed inward, a beast brought down by its own weight. The shockwave slammed into, knocking the breath from her chest. She gasped, coughing, ears ringing with the echo. The ridge lit with fire, shadows thrown wild against the night. The enemy scattered, shouts panicked now, desperate. The tide broke for the first time. In the wadi, the team roared in triumph, their cheers fierce, ragged, alive. For a moment, just a moment, survival felt possible. Lay on her back, staring up at the sky, chest heaving. The stars burned brighter now, cruel and beautiful. Hawk loomed into view above her, hand outstretched. She took it. His grip was strong, steady, pulling her to her feet. For once his eyes softened, just barely, enough for her to see what lay beneath the stone, respect. But the night wasn't over, not yet. The engine still growled in the distance. The headlights still danced along the ridge. And the clock still ticked. 30 minutes to go. How long can a body endure before the spirit breaks? The desert had turned into a furnace of noise and smoke. The carrier's wreck still burned, flames licking skyward, black smoke trailing into the stars. The team crouched in the wadi, breaths ragged, rifles clutched like lifelines. For a fleeting moment, they had broken the tide, but fleeting was all it was. Engines still rumbled beyond the ridge. Trucks repositioned, shouts echoed, boots pounded against sand. The enemy wasn't gone. They were regrouping, waiting, watching. Wiped grit from her eyes, her chest still heaving. Her hands shook not from fear but from exhaustion. Her body screamed for rest, for water, for silence. None of those existed here. She caught Hawk's gaze. He didn't speak, but the look was enough. Stay steady. The radio crackled again, command's voice filtered through static. Extraction window confirmed. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. It might as well have been a lifetime. The unit spread along the wadi wall, rifles steadied, eyes unblinking despite the sting of smoke and sweat. Pressed her cheek to the stock once more, scope cutting the night into narrow focus. Her vision blurred at the edges, exhaustion creeping in, but she pushed it back. There would be time to collapse later, if later existed. Movement flickered at the ridge. Dozens of them, silhouettes against the firelight, spreading in arcs, pressing closer with patience now. No rush, no recklessness. The enemy had learned. A voice muttered nearby, hoarse with fatigue. "They're tightening the noose." Swallowed hard, he wasn't wrong. The first volley came sharp and sudden. Bullets shredded earth, sparks showered stone. The team returned fire, sharp bursts cracking through the night. Fingers squeezed, shot after shot, each one measured, precise, cutting figures from the ridge. Her body begged to tremble, but her training anchored her hands steady. Minutes blurred. The air reeked of gunpowder and burning steel. Ears rang with a constant symphony of fire. Shoulder throbbed from recoil, bruised deep, but she ignored it. Her world had shrunk into the trigger, the breath, the sight picture. A shout ripped through comms. Left flank, they're pushing hard. Pivoted, scope locking onto shadows surging low along the slope. Too close, too fast, her pulse spiked. She fired, one dropped, then another, but more pressed on. Muzzles flashed, bullets hissed past her ear. Dirt stung her cheek. Then Hawk was beside her, his rifle barking sharp, controlled. Together they cut the wave before it reached the wadi. Sand soaked dark where bodies fell. The silence after was brief, suffocating. "You hold lines well," Hawk muttered, reloading. His voice wasn't mocking this time. It was simple truth. Blinked at him, but he was already scanning the ridge again, eyes sharp. Respect wasn't declared. It was given in fragments like this. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe steady to reset. The night didn't care about emotions. The night only cared about survival. Another explosion split the dark, closer this time. Earth shook, sand rained down from the wadi's rim. Flinched, ears ringing, teeth clenching against the shockwave. A soldier cried out. Down the line, one of theirs clutched his shoulder, blood seeping fast between his fingers. "Medic," someone shouted. Shifted her scope, covering as the medic crawled through dirt, hands working frantically. The wounded man's groans mixed with gunfire, a brutal reminder of how fragile their wall really was. She fired again, steady, forcing herself not to look. She couldn't afford to see faces, not now. 15 minutes. The enemy surged again. Trucks roared closer, headlights sweeping the wadi. Gunfire erupted in torrents, sparks flying, sand exploding into the air. Fired until her magazine ran dry, hands moving fast, slamming another home. Her lips moved without sound, her father's words again, whispered like prayer. "A bullet doesn't just fly, it tells a story." Each round was a sentence, each kill a punctuation in survival's desperate grammar. Her body ached, her throat burned with thirst, her arms felt leaden, but she pushed on, steady, always steady. 10 minutes. Another shout down the line. "They're in the trench." Whipped around. Shadows dropped over the wadi rim, landing among them. The fight turned savage, close, brutal. Rifles slammed into faces, knives flashed, fists struck. Vision narrowed, a figure lunging at her with wild eyes, rifle raised like a club. She fired point blank. The blast deafened her, the recoil jolting through bone. The man crumpled, lifeless at her knees. Her breath came ragged, chest heaving. Blood speckled her cheek, not hers. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Hawk dragged another attacker down, knife flashing, swift, final. His face was stone, but his breathing heavy. Hemet's eyes gave the briefest nod. Then the fight pressed on. 7 minutes. The wadi was smoke, fire, chaos. Voices screamed through comms, through throats, through the night itself. Ears rang with a constant roar, but she fired, reloaded, fired again. Her movements automatic, instinct honed by every hour she'd ever spent behind a rifle. Her hands were raw, her face streaked with sweat and dust, her uniform torn. She felt herself breaking, piece by piece, but she clung to one thought: not yet, not until it was over. 5 minutes. The enemy pressed harder, desperate now, sensing how close the fight was to breaking. Trucks rolled closer, headlights pouring white fire into the trench. Shadows surged, endless. Fired until the barrel burned hot, until her breath came in ragged sobs. Beside her, Hawk roared into comms. "Where the hell is our bird?" Static answered, then faint but rising, the sound they'd been waiting for. Rotors. The thunder of blades cutting through the night, growing louder, closer. His chest clenched. Relief, sharp and painful, surged through her veins. The team lifted their heads, hope flickering like flame. But the enemy heard it too. Their fire redoubled, frantic, desperate to finish before extraction could pull the unit from the jaws. 3 minutes. "Hold," Hawk shouted. Braced, firing, teeth bared in defiance. Her vision blurred, edges darkening, but she refused to stop. She would not stop. The helicopter swept overhead, spotlight cutting the desert open. Its guns roared, shredding the ridge, tearing vehicles into fireballs. The wadi lit with flame and chaos. The tide broke. The enemy scattered. "Go," Hawk commanded. The team scrambled from the trench, boots pounding, bodies dragging wounded. Ran, lungs burning, every step agony. Bullets still snapped, but the helicopter's fire carved their path. The bird's ramp lowered, hands reached, voices shouted. stumbled up the ramp, collapsing into steel and sweat and life. Hawk was the last aboard, shoving a wounded man ahead of him before pulling himself in. The ramp closed. The desert fell away. Inside, the red light returned. Faces streaked with blood and grit, eyes wide, breaths ragged, alive. Leaned against the wall, rifle slipping from her grasp. Her body trembled, but her heart was steady. For the first time, steady. Across from her, Hawk sat heavily, his chest rising and falling. His Medal of Honor still pinned, streaked with dust. Their eyes met. No words passed. None were needed. She had held the line. And in that silence, in the roar of rotors carrying them away from fire, realized something. Respect wasn't given by a medal or by a bet. It was earned in dirt, in blood, in the spaces between despair and defiance. And she had earned it. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? The helicopter's rotors had long faded into memory, replaced by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the faint antiseptic sting of the infirmary. Hours had passed since the desert, but's body still carried its weight. Her hands shook as she unwrapped her bandaged knuckles, raw and swollen from firing, from fighting, from surviving. She flexed her fingers slowly, as if convincing herself they still belonged to her. Around her, the unit was scattered across cots, some stitched, some wrapped, some staring blankly at the ceiling. The wounded man who'd taken a bullet to the shoulder drifted in and out of sleep, his face pale but steady. No one spoke much. Survival had a way of stealing words. Hawk sat in the far corner, his arm wrapped, his face shadowed by exhaustion. He hadn't taken off the medal. Dust still clung to it, streaks of smoke smudging its shine. Caught herself staring. The same medal he had wagered so recklessly, the same medal she had thought was the key to belonging. Now it looked smaller, just metal, not the weight she had once imagined. She lowered her eyes, guilt prickling her chest. She had pulled the trigger that brought hell down on them. Yes, it had saved the team from being discovered, but it had also unleashed the storm that nearly buried them. Was survival the same as victory, or had they simply escaped death long enough to delay it? Her mind replayed every moment, the shot, the charge, the carrier erupting in flame. She saw the faces of those she killed, flickers in the crosshairs. Too fast to know, too slow to forget. She pressed her hands against her temples, forcing the images back. A voice cut through the haze. "You think too loud." Lifted her head. Hawk stood over her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. She tried to steady her breath. "I made the call, pulled the trigger. They found us because of it." He tilted his head slightly. "You think they weren't going to find us? That patrol wasn't out there by chance. You bought us time." Her lips parted, but no words came. Time, that's all it had been. Hawk's gaze lingered. "You're asking the wrong question, Lieutenant. Don't ask if you caused it. Ask if your team is alive. Because of you, they are." Swallowed hard. The truth was heavy, but it didn't erase the guilt. Not completely. Later that night, the unit gathered in the mess hall. The room buzzed with low voices, the scrape of trays, the metallic clink of cutlery. Soldiers moved between tables, tired but alive. Sat at the edge, eating little, her thoughts still buried in the desert. She could feel eyes on her, some nods of acknowledgement, some stares unreadable. Then it happened. One of the men raised his glass. A simple gesture. He didn't speak, but his eyes met hers before he tipped it slightly in respect. Others followed. Small, silent nods. No cheers, no claps, just quiet recognition offered piece by piece. His chest tightened. Not triumph, not pride, just something deeper, belonging. When she finally left the hall, the night air hit her cool and sharp. She walked until the base lights faded, until the desert stretched wide again, quiet under the stars. She sat on the edge of a dune, knees pulled tight, staring out at the horizon. The silence out here wasn't heavy like the infirmary. It was vast, endless, and strangely kind. Footsteps approached. Hawk, she didn't turn. He sat beside her, the sand crunching under his weight. For a long while neither spoke. The desert hummed with its own quiet music, wind brushing across stone, the distant whine of a generator, the endless hush of space. Finally, Hawk spoke. His voice was lower than she'd ever heard it. "You know why I carry this?" He tapped the metal, the faint clink breaking the stillness. Glanced at it, then at him. His face was turned toward the stars, his jaw tight. "It's not for me," he said. "It's for the ones who didn't come back. Every time I look at it, I remember their faces, their voices, their last breaths. It's not honor, it's weight." His words dug into her chest. She wanted to ask why he'd risked something so sacred on her, but the answer was already in his tone. He hadn't wagered the metal because he valued it less. He wagered it because he valued truth more, to see who she really was when everything was on the line. His throat tightened. She whispered, "And did I prove it?" Hawk's eyes shifted to her, searching, steady. Then, after a long pause, he gave the smallest nod. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was enough. For the first time since she'd arrived, felt something ease in her chest. The whispers, the judgment, the weight of being an outsider, they didn't vanish, but they lost their teeth. She wasn't trying to prove herself anymore. She simply was. Days later, the mission's debrief filled sterile rooms with charts and reports. Command spoke of success, of intelligence gathered, of shipments disrupted. Numbers and metrics, but none of that touched the truth carried. Success wasn't measured in papers. It was measured in breath still drawn, in the sight of men alive because she had pulled the trigger when it mattered. She carried that truth quietly, stitched into her like a scar. But nights were harder. Sleep came in fragments. When it did, it brought faces. The patrol in her scope, the man who lunged at her in the trench, the glow of cigarettes in the tower, faces that would never leave because she had taken them. One night she woke gasping, sweat soaking her uniform. Her chest heaved as she pressed her palms into her eyes, forcing back the images. A knock at the door startled her. Hawk stood in the dim hallway, eyes tired but steady. He didn't ask what she'd seen. He didn't need to, he simply said, "Walk with me." They walked in silence through the base, out into the desert again. The stars stretched wide, infinite, cold. Hawk finally spoke. "You don't ever forget, not the faces, not the sounds. They'll come back, over and over, you can't change that." His voice carried no softness, no comfort, just truth. Swallowed, her throat dry. "Then how do you live with it?" He stopped walking, staring out at the horizon. The pause stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then softly he said, "You don't live with it, you carry it. And you decide every day whether it breaks you or builds you." His words lingered, heavy, sharp, but oddly freeing. She didn't have to erase the guilt. She didn't have to silence the memories. She simply had to carry them and keep walking. They stood there a long time, side by side, two silhouettes beneath an endless sky. No whispers, no judgment, just the weight of what they'd survived and the quiet bond of those who had stood in fire together. For it was enough. Why does silence sometimes speak louder than applause? Weeks passed. The desert mission became another line in reports, another debrief filed, another classified folder stacked into a cabinet where dust would someday claim it. To command, it was numbers, trucks destroyed, weapons intercepted, 0 casualties on their side. To the soldiers, it was memories, bruises that ached in the night, scars not all of them could see. Two, it was something deeper, something that lived in the pauses between breaths, in the way she now carried herself through the halls of the base. No longer with the sharp edge of someone trying to prove she belonged, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who already knew she did. The whispers had stopped, not all at once, not with cheers or grand gestures. They faded, replaced by nods in passing, by voices that once doubted now calling her lieutenant with weight in the word. She wasn't the rookie anymore. She was one of them. But belonging came with its price. Nights were restless. Dreams returned with faces, some she had saved, some she had ended. The line between the two blurred until she woke in the dark, chest tight, hands shaking. She never told anyone. Some truths were carried in silence. One evening, after drills and reports and the endless hum of base life, she found herself in the armory again. The same place it had begun. The rows of rifles gleamed under fluorescent light, the air still heavy with oil and gunpowder. Men moved in and out, voices low, but the room wasn't the same. She wasn't the same. Her eyes drifted to the far corner where Hawk stood, arms crossed, watching. His presence was the same steady, unreadable, carved from the kind of battles that left more scars than medals. He said nothing as she cleaned her rifle, as she checked the scope, the barrel, the stock. But when the others filtered out, leaving only the two of them, his voice came. "You hit harder than they thought you would." Looked up, he wasn't smirking, he wasn't testing. His tone was even, almost reflective. "They'll remember that night," he continued. "Not because of me, not because of a medal, because of you." Her chest tightened. "You still kept it," she said softly, nodding toward the ribbon of blue and white that hung from his chest. He glanced down at it, then back at her. "I told you what this means. It's not mine to lose, but respect." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Respect isn't pinned on your chest, it's carried in your actions. You've got it now, don't waste it." The words struck deeper than she expected. Respect. Not a gift, not a gamble, something earned in fire and silence. Later that night, walked alone to the edge of the desert. The base lights glowed faintly behind her, a reminder of walls and order. Ahead, the sand stretched infinite, stars sprawled across the sky like ancient scars. She sat, knees pulled close, the rifle across her lap. For the first time, she let herself breathe without fear of judgment, without the weight of eyes watching. She thought of her father, his voice, his words, the way he had taught her that a bullet told a story. She thought of the story she had written in the desert, one she had never asked to tell but had etched all the same. The impossible shot had earned silence. The firefight had earned survival. But here, under the stars, she realized something more. Strength wasn't in the medal she hadn't won. It wasn't even in the respect she had earned. It was in carrying the weight without letting it break her. In waking every day to the faces she would never forget and choosing to keep walking anyway. The wind whispered across the dunes, soft and endless. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. Hawk's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "You decide every day whether it breaks you or builds you." She opened her eyes, the stars burning above her, the desert stretching wide and merciless and beautiful. Her chest rose with a slow, steady breath. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It doesn't need a medal to prove itself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.